Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the third webinar from our series Gold Myths. I'm very excited about today's webinar on mercury under the title Mercury Matters. How can we eradicate mercury in ASM? And also very pleased to be joined today by three outstanding experts in the field. We've got Susan Keane here from NRDC, joining us from Washington. My colleague Cyrus joining us from Nairobi, and Barbara, who I believe is based in the Netherlands, working for IUCN. The session is going to be fairly interesting. I'll give it another few seconds before we jump right into the content for more people to join, but thank you already for taking the time. Questions can be asked at the end and already throughout the Q&A, throughout the session using the Q&A function. And we hope to finish the presentations in 45 to 50 minutes so that we've got 10 to 15 minutes for questions. But in preparation, we also saw that we've got a lot of content. So please excuse us if we don't have time to answer all the questions. I will try to follow up on specific questions where possible, also in writing during the webinar. But that being said, thanks everybody for taking the time and joining. And Cyrus, I'd be more than happy for you to start explaining how mercury is linked to artisanal gold mining.
Thank you, David. Perhaps to start and explain how mercury finds its way with the gold miners. Mercury is very just a silver liquid or a chemical substance that the artisanal miners use for their processing. These are through the process called amalgamation process. And the miners prefer using mercury because they find it easy to use and takes very little time to do it. Unfortunately, the same miners are oblivious to the dangers posed by mercury during the processing time. We all understand how toxic mercury is, the fumes, and even the contact with the skin. Perhaps I've mentioned about amalgamation. We could check through the next slide, David, just to explain how that process goes. Here we're talking about artisanal miners washing their gold ore, which is in form of powder, on top of a sluice box, very kind of timber with a mat on top. And once they get a concentrate after washing the powder, it is further panned. We are talking of rotating a kind of a pan or a bowl, where they have to also reduce on extra lighter materials, so that after this they put some drops of mercury and thoroughly they make sure that they mix the remaining concentrate to capture the gold particles. It is at this point we find that they're exposed to even a skin exposure, that is the mercury, and we also find at this point they get some gold pellets, or else we'd call it a gold amalgam. This amalgam is further subjected as a step 3, is further subjected to heat, and the reason for this is to make sure that excess mercury is freed. And we find also that this is also another point where the miners inhale these mercury fumes. So basically, that is how the miners use the mercury during their processing. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Cyrus. And maybe worth adding is that mercury is the most used processing method by most artisanal miners because it's so readily available and easy to use without much machinery. The only thing that you need here is a Bunsen burner or even hot coals to burn off the mercury in that step 3. So understandably a very easy process. And at a later stage today, we'll look at alternative processes, and all of them require some investment in machines. But Susan, could you please just shine a light on the extent of mercury use, and also looking from an environmental protection perspective, what is the role of artisanal mining in mercury use?
Sure. So the previous slide, you saw that relatively small pellet in the pan. You think, oh, well, you know, how bad can that be? It's a very small amount. But collectively, artisanal and small-scale gold mining has a huge global impact. No one knows the real exact numbers, but usually it's estimated that somewhere between 10 and 20 million miners directly are working in the artisanal small-scale gold mining sector. And the sector accounts for about 20% of global gold supply. Of course, you know, those are estimates. It could be higher, especially given the high price of gold now might be attracting more miners. As you can see in the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, that big orange section is artisanal small-scale gold mining's contribution to global emissions. ASGM is the largest industrial, if you want to say, the intentional use of mercury in the world collectively, and it remains the largest source of emissions. And while the chart shows emissions to air, it's also the largest source of releases to land and water as well. And those two together, land and water and air, and also air, account for about 2,000 tons of mercury emitted to the global environment every year. Next slide, please. Thanks. So why do we care? Well, we care because mercury is an extremely toxic chemical. Its most well-known effects are probably on the nervous system. Many people have heard about the effects on the growing brain of young children and the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system of minors and others who are directly exposed. But it also has effects on other systems of the body, importantly cardiovascular effects, respiratory, kidney, immune effects, and digestion. So it's very widespread systemic toxicant at very relatively low doses. Next slide, please. So recognizing the danger of global mercury pollution, the international community got together, believe it or not, and created the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which went into effect in 2017. The convention itself covers all different sources of mercury pollution and is intended to control those sources. Article 7 of the convention specifically covers reducing mercury use from small-scale gold mining. Specifically, Article 7 requires parties to the convention that have small-scale gold mining to reduce and, where feasible, eliminate mercury use in the sector. For those parties that have what's considered significant use of mercury in the sector, they are required to actually write a concrete national action plan that describes strategies for reducing or eliminating, where feasible, mercury use in the sector. And you can see on this slide, Annex C of the convention dictates the content of those plans. They can't just be whatever the parties want to include. There's a very specific list of kinds of strategies that parties must consider when reducing mercury use. And really embodied in this plan is the notion of trying to reduce both supply and demand for mercury use in the sector in concert. So as you can see, for example, under the enabling policy framework, one of the most important things to do is to manage mercury trade, to really control the amount of mercury that's going into the system. And then for technical strategies, you can see there are strategies to eliminate the worst practices and to reduce emissions, releases, and exposures, primarily really through the introduction of low mercury or, where possible, mercury-free technologies. So it's this, you know, combined effort of reducing supply and demand at the same time, which we hope will actually eventually eliminate mercury use from the sector.
Thank you, Susan. And that is a perfect bridge to Barbara, who spent the last year or so looking into the trade, a topic that was not much discussed before, Barbara, and is linked, as you can see here, to a lot of the informal economy. So please take it from here.
Yes, thanks, David. So exactly, so we decided to look into a bit more of the mercury trade. So basically, since 2011 and 2013, the EU and the US have a mercury export ban. And since then, of course, the formal trade shifted quite a lot worldwide. And the first thing that we realized when we looked into some official data, for example, as you can see here from the UN Comtrade, is that often what, for example, country A reports as having exported to country B doesn't match up with what country B reports as having received from country A. So we have a huge discrepancy in data for the formal mercury trade. And as Susan also said, most of the data that is available for ASGM is based on estimates, even concerning the gold production. So if we want to estimate more or less how much mercury is used, we can use the regional mercury to gold ratios, because commonly mercury is used in a certain ratio to gold, and therefore we can have an estimate of how much a country would, or how much of mercury a country would need to support their ASGM sector. As you can see, that is another problem here, because we base, of course, an estimate on an estimate. But even looking at these numbers, you can tell that some countries import way too little mercury to support their ASGM sector, and other countries import a lot more. Next slide, please. Therefore, we decided to look into 8 countries to get a bit more detail, both on the formal and the informal trade. And we decided to look on into Guyana, Suriname, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, 3 countries in East Africa, and the Philippines. And basically, I can't present all results here, but I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of some of them. Next slide, please. But our main objectives for all of these countries were to understand the flows of mercury, both formally and informally, not only from which country they originate, but also what happens inside the countries or the regions, and to understand the trade hubs, the supply chains, the actors involved, and also the driving force behind mercury trade. And with that, we hope to enhance the governance of mercury in ASGM, and also to show that it's really a global problem, that there are similar mechanisms in place in different countries, and that it's not just something that is happening in one country or in one region of the world. Next slide, please. Thanks. So to just give you a little bit of insight, I selected East Africa as an example here. For East Africa, it really came out through the investigations that our partners did on the ground, that the mercury trade in the region is so connected that we analyzed it together. And as you can see, there's a lot of trade going on within the whole region. Most mercury enters the region through Kenya, and Kenya's formal imports are multiple amounts of the amounts of the Tanzanian or the Ugandan imports, for example. And actually, while there are informal imports into Kenya, mainly also through the port of Mombasa, for example, through container ships from China, actually a lot of the mercury that enters the region is formally traded. And it's officially for industrial use, but the amounts are so big that it's not very logic that all of it can actually be used in industry. So most of that mercury is thought to be informally diverted into the use for ASGM, both within Kenya, but also in the whole region. And you can see there is a lot of cross-border trade. We distinguished kind of 2 flows. You can see in orange the primary flows, which we basically defined as flows of the most common directions, so often from one trading hub to the mining areas. But also there are secondary flows, which are of the exact opposite direction. And these trading flows depend on supply, demand, and price within the 3 countries. And it really goes to an extent where traders pass each other at a border going the opposite direction. So you see there is so much trade going on. It's very interesting to observe. And one of the big problems, of course, is that the borders in some of the regions are very porous. So we have heard that there, for example, people kind of checking out which roads are being monitored so they can then tell the people who transport the mercury to use another road, or that they also use, for example, disabled people in wheelchairs to transport mercury across the borders because they get less often controlled by officials. And that also leads me to some information on the supply chain, where basically we found that there are really cartel-like structures in place, similar to when you look at, for example, drug trafficking or drug trade, with basically the big importers and the big traders sitting in the main cities and the capitals, and they have their middlemen and actors that are more in the mining areas. And often these middlemen, they don't own the mercury, and they also, some of them are not really well informed. So in case they do get picked up by officials, that they cannot tell any of the trade secrets, basically. And why there's such big structures in place is because mercury trade is very lucrative. So especially high in the supply chain, so for the importers and the wholesalers, they can make a lot of money just by trading with mercury. However, what we found in this region and in other regions, as you will see, is that the mercury trade is quite linked to the gold trade. So often it's the same people involved, the same trade routes that are being used by the people, which means, of course, that people involved in both trades also benefit even more financially from the trade. Thanks. And that was it on East Africa. Now we look a bit into the Philippines. You can see here the supply chain for the Philippines. And for the Philippines, the case is that basically mercury is not at all allowed in ASGM because ASGM is not really formal either. So only very, very limited amounts of mercury get imported into the Philippines formally. So what we can say is that most of the mercury used in ASGM is imported informally, mainly through two channels, the formal ports, where it's often the case that either it just isn't noticed when it enters, but there's also bribing happening in the ports. The second entrance is through informal ports, which are basically the same routes that are being used for other illegal goods that are being smuggled into the island. From there, the mercury goes to wholesalers, mainly in the larger cities, and then to smaller traders, which are located in the ASGM communities. And you can also see here that there is a link between the traders of gold and mercury again. And actually in the Philippines, this goes to an extent where miners are actually being really kept on the hook to keep using mercury, because sometimes, for example, the mercury gets provided for free to the miners under the condition that they then sell the extracted gold back to the same trader for a reduced price. Or sometimes it's also just one trader of both mercury and gold in the region. And if the miner would refuse to buy the mercury, then the trader might not get the gold from this miner, so the miner ends up not having an income for the day. Another big source that we can see on the lower side of the picture is the confiscated mercury as a secondary source that reappears in the markets, which we have heard that it is often being confiscated somewhere inside the country and then being resold actually by officials. Next slide, please. As a last example, I'm just going to briefly look into Burkina Faso. Burkina is basically importing very little amounts itself. Most of the mercury in the region comes through Togo. And Togo actually doesn't have a very large ASGM sector itself. So it's thought to really be the case that most mercury gets distributed throughout the whole region. And as you can see in the map, most of it goes through Burkina Faso and then really further on through Mali and even further. The same is valid for Burkina Faso in the gold trade, so it's also a hub there. And we can see in the supply chain, if you look at, for example, the traders, the wholesalers, and the local dealers, that also here we have a very strong link to gold dealers, so between the mercury and the gold trade here. However, I do want to mention that this is not the case for every country. So if we would be looking into Latin America, for example, there is a lot of trade also happening, and also sometimes the people are involved in both trades. But we do not have these mechanisms in place that keep kind of miners on the hook to keep using mercury. So this depends a bit in which country you're looking. Next slide, please. However, we did find kind of key findings across the different regions when we analyzed our findings from all the countries. And we categorized them in different groups. So one of the first problems was that there are a lot of things that are hindering our understanding. It starts with, as we explained, that there is very little data on ASGM due to the informality of the sector, that even the data on formal trade, formal mercury trade, is not very clearly reported because a lot of the reporting is done voluntarily. And of course, the informality of a lot of the trade is a problem because it's not only hard to understand these cartel-like structures, but it actually is dangerous in places to investigate these. Then the next problem that we ran into is, or the next factors that we could find are the factors that still keep towards contributing to the use of mercury. What I mean with tradition here is that mercury has just been around for a really long time. So a lot of the miners, they grew up using mercury. Their parents used mercury. They might have even played with mercury as kids. And mercury takes a really long time until some of the health effects actually show up. So even if miners might know that it's not healthy, it's sometimes really hard for them to pick that up because they do need to have an income at the end of the day, and they've been using it forever. So that's kind of why it's stuck in the communities. As we have heard before, also, mercury is very easy to use and it's very cheap to get. So the problem that a lot of miners don't have financial resources obviously also contributes to the continued use of mercury. And the last part is that there are, in some countries, there's supply chain mechanisms in place that kind of link the gold and the mercury trade, which then obviously contributes to that some miners who might want to change away from mercury cannot really do that. So if we look at all these things together, we can say that the driving force behind the trade are not the miners, even though they're the ones who use the mercury in the end, but that the driving force is really higher up in the supply chain where the money gets made. And another problem we found is that a lot of the countries have governance issues, going from ambiguous laws up to problems controlling the border, obviously. Now we can go to the next one. Thanks. So just to very briefly talk about how we can maybe tackle that problem. It's a very complicated problem involving lots of different levels. So here are just a few recommendations. First of all, we think through formalizing the ASGM sector and giving miners, for example, access to health benefits, but also financial resources from the government, that would help them to reduce their dependency in some cases. Of course, then we also need to look into how informal mercury enters the countries. So we need to strengthen borders and also train officials, because very often they just also honestly don't know what to look for. For the official mercury that enters a country, the laws just need to be clearer, and there should be a mechanism in place that kind of follows the mercury so that the diversion into ASGM is harder. To avoid this problem, for example, that we had in the Philippines, where confiscated mercury reappears on the markets, there need to be storage facilities in place, because in a lot of the countries, actually, even if it gets confiscated, people don't know what to do with it. So then it's very easy for it to reappear on the markets. And we have seen in a lot of countries that once one country kind of increases laws and regulations on mercury imports, for example, the neighboring country just imports more, and it very easily goes across the border. So we actually need not only regional and national, but also an international collaboration. Besides that, I think it's very important that we strengthen the linkages between the formal gold market, or to the formal gold market, and to keep improving basically connections for mercury-free gold in the market. And besides that, of course, we should keep working on projects that work with the transition to mercury-free technologies with a long-term support. And I think with that also, we will hear a bit more about mercury-free techniques afterwards now. But next slide, yeah. Basically, this was just a very, very brief overview. And if you're interested in more detail, you can download our report in which we summarize all the findings. There are also reports available for the different countries that really go into depth. So you can find all of these in the link below And with that, I hand over back to you, David.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I already see a couple of questions coming up, so hopefully we get to them later. But that was really fascinating, and yeah, maybe if we have time later, you can also talk a bit about the methodology beyond the data comparisons. I also know that getting quite a lot of that insight was a fairly exciting process. So, but yeah, moving on then to the second half of the issue as Susan described it. It's not only addressing illegal trade, but obviously also looking for alternatives. And Cyrus, who's a mining engineer, has been working for the last year and a half now with miners throughout East Africa to provide solutions to reduce and replace mercury. And with this, I hand over to you, Cyrus.
Thank you, David. Yeah, talking of addressing the mercury issues and how we can manage mercury. The options that we have here, we are talking about having a way to reduce and also getting to make sure that the emission are put to that the control is quite done on the same. And the second option that we have is also on how do we transition to a mercury-free method or system or even techniques. Exploring further on how do we reduce that, maybe David, you can take us to the next slide. The first option that I mentioned on how to reduce mercury use and maybe emission, we have what we call the mercury lithodes. They are not new. They are always being used by the miners in different places. A mercury lithodes, when you're talking about mercury lithodes, we are saying it's a small-sized fabrication. It can be done locally. And what it does, it helps the artisanal miners to burn their gold amalgam in a controlled environment. This means that it's possible to recover the mercury, that is the mercury films condenses back to liquid, and the miners can reuse it. This is the best thing about mercury lithodes, in that even the emission, the mercury emission are cut to close between 90 to 95%. This is a good way to make sure that emission don't get to the miners. And also we realize that unfortunately that the miners or the technology doesn't get to the miners with a very good speed, and the miners takes time to adopt it, even when they are aware that it can also help them to cast cost on their purchase of mercury. Well, it is a very good gadget that even the impact facility, we are trying to work on a project with eight artisanal gold mining miners in Western Kenya, to make sure that they can adopt this practice. And this is through collaboration that we are doing with a jeweler company called Makal. Well, David, you can take us to the next one. Basically, talking of on management or reducing, we don't have much options, but what we can do now is to check how do we transition, how do we prepare ourselves to a mercury-free processing. And first thing here is not to check on which equipment to use, but it's checking on how well do we prepare our ore, or our gold ore, which comes from the mines. And the first step that we ask or we do is to make sure that we crush the material in a good way, in a uniform way, from bigger boulders to small sizes to an inch or a half, so that they can further be processed with a ball mill. But before then, talking of crushing, we talk of using normal hammers, that is hammer on top of a hard stone. This can be done by everyone in the mine. And also there's an option of mechanical crusher, which miners can also buy. It helps also to crush uniformly. Talking of now the material that you have crushed or reduced the size, you take them to a ball mill. A ball mill helps to reduce the size further to a powder form. Of course, it's a very critical area where we ask ourselves, how much do we need to do this, so that we can always make sure that we liberate, or we make sure that gold particles are free as possible. This means that we need to check on how we grind. We don't need to overgrind or undergrind, and this means that you need to watch the grain size as the ball mill. After some time, after the ball mill, it's continuing to mill. So maybe after 20 minutes, the miner can take a sample and make sure that he does some panning and see the amount of gold in it. And maybe after another 20 minutes, and there's a time that they can find that there's a time that gives the highest amount of gold. This is the liberation test or grain size determination. This can always be done by the miners. In the next picture, we find that we have prepared our own, and it's in the powder form, ready for further processing. Perhaps, David, you can take us to the next slide, please. Yeah, so after getting the light powder, the light size, the light grain size, we need to first to make sure that we are able to free or to remove any unwanted material or any unwanted particles. This is through the principle of gravity concentration. The gravity concentration has or can be enhanced by use of different equipment. But the principle behind all of this equipment is that they take advantage of the particle size, shape, and most importantly, the density or the density of the particle. We all know that gold particles are dense, and compared to other particles that are in a mineral rock. So at this point, we either use, we have centrifugal concentrator, vortex, or we have a shaking table, and also the normal sluice box. If it's done well with a sluice mat, which can capture as much gold as possible, it is part and parcel of what we call gravity concentration method. So this is where now we make sure that we reduce as much as possible the lighter materials and make sure that we are left with the most fine concentrate of gold for further processing. And before then, perhaps I can combine this with another method, David, for the next slide, please. Yeah, this is also a gravity method, which we call the gold drop technology. Of course, it's a new method that is coming to the market, is being tested in many countries. And what we realize is that it uses the same principle where particle size, shape, and density, they are passed through a chamber, whereas we find that there's a fluid going in the opposite direction, so that the heavier material will always find its way in a different chamber. So this technology is also finding a way in the market in a way as a concentration method. However, it has the disadvantage of getting that the material or the concentration material that is being done, it needs to, it should not have embedded itself in the main rock. This means it needs to fully be liberated, and also there's possibility of the material or the gold particles to be as big as possible. Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. After we get after we get the concentrates, we are talking of very fine concentrates ready for what we call direct smelting. This is where we talk of extraction method that doesn't need to use mercury. And like I said before, getting to smelting stage, we have to get it light from the point that we crush the light amount, we concentrate well until we get the finest of the material. And this is a point that we are talking of having or getting our concentrate in a bowl. We normally call it a crucible. It can sustain high temperature. And at this point, we can add chemicals like borax and silica, which act as flux to make sure that the melting point of the concentrate is brought as low as possible. And talking of temperature at this point, we should have a good temperature of at least 1200. We understand that this is a point that's where gold melts or flows as a liquid, in liquid form. And this is a point that we are sure that gold can always be separated from any other minerals because it's now on its own in terms of the separation process. And when we are doing smelting, we are sure that the concentrate grade should be as high as 98%. Of course, comparing this with the gold amalgam, which gives us almost 88%, this is a very good way to find that we can concentrate as much as possible and make sure that we embrace the direct smelting process. Yeah, you can take us to the next method which we can look at. And this is what we call the leaching technology. During the leaching technology, we are talking of the whole concentrate, the whole material that has been crushed. It needs to be put in we call them the leaching tanks, leaching containers, and where we have chemicals. These chemicals will dissolve all the concentrate. Those that dissolve among them is gold. And once it is dissolved, it is possible now to make sure that we filter or to let go any other material that doesn't dissolve in these chemicals. And getting back, we can now be sure that we can transform back the gold particles into solid by capturing them with carbon and also other chemical which can easily get to trap gold ions. But the most popular one is carbon. At this point, it is now possible to work on carbon, which is leach with gold ion. This is a process we call elution, and also heating, and we can find also there's some direct smelting in the process. The process will also yield some good, it yield well because it gives 90% and above when done in good condition. Of course, talking of the leaching methods, the most popular one is the cyanide leaching. We have heap type of the vat and agitated tank. The agitated tank being the most popular. And the other one that's it's also coming up is by use of sodium disulfate. It's a chemical, but this agent is it's believed to be cleaner in terms of environment and even the people because it doesn't have much effect than the cyanide. And this also uses the same principle as the same principle of the leaching. The last one in the leaching category is iguri. This is by use of agents like hydrochloric acid and chlorine or bleach. And this also is taking shape in the ASM sector because it's designed mostly for small plants. And it is possible now to find that even a community of ASM miners can afford a small plant, and they can always get to process with this kind of system. Of course, all these systems have some cost implication, but in the long run, these are the most appropriate ways to make sure that we move away from mercury process. It is because of other policies that are coming up that we'll find that we will always need to adopt this kind of technology. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Cyrus. And yeah, your last point is very important, that the investment costs for some of these technologies can be fairly high. We have a lot of questions around the different ways of processing, so let's make sure we get to that. But it all seems a bit too good to be true, Cyrus. If there's all these solutions readily available, then why is nobody using them? And I think Susan can shine some light on that question for us.
Sorry,
You're
I was
still on
muted.
mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, right. Cyrus did a great job just elaborating on there are quite a large number of different kinds of technologies available. Why aren't they more widespread? And I've listed some of the issues here. They're not in any particular order, and they all have different influence in different ASM communities with regard to their relative importance. So I'll just go over some of them. One barrier is actually lack of knowledge, detailed knowledge about the ore and its nature that prevents the small-scale miner from really understanding exactly which of these technologies would work. You know, they're very used to what they already have. It works for them, and they're really just bewildered by what they could do differently that would actually give them same or better gold yield. So just fundamental lack of technical knowledge is one barrier. Even if they have such knowledge, though, as David alluded to already, the very high cost of capital for many of these miners, being in a largely informal sector, their access to formal finance is extremely limited. Most of their finance at this point comes from informal financial systems, either friends or family, or as Barbara talked about before, often finance comes from the gold buyers, not only in the form of mercury, but also in other kinds of operational costs. So until we can really overcome those root causes of informality and those perceived risks with the ASM sector, it will be very hard for small-scale miners to access formal finance needed to buy this kind of equipment. Sometimes the methods described just aren't scalable to the small scale setting. So while they could be applied, there are just social and economic barriers to doing so. Or those, maybe it could be done, but it would really require reorganization of the way miners do business. They would have to form cooperatives, for example, to get enough scale in order to be able to apply some of these technologies. So that becomes a big barrier. There is, of course, lack of technical expertise, not just about choosing the appropriate technology, but also how to operate it effectively and safely. And that's a special concern with something like cyanide, which requires quite a lot of technical expertise, and absent that expertise could be quite dangerous to use. So that's a concern. The processing time of some of these technologies is slower than mercury. Mercury is fast. You get your concentrate, you apply your mercury, you burn it, you have gold. Whereas other technologies, for example, the time it takes for cyanide leaching to occur is too slow for miners who need cash on a daily basis in order to survive. So that's a barrier. Barbara alluded to another barrier in her talk about these ingrained relationships between miners and the gold buyers who supply mercury. That's a very, very common relationship all over the world, that gold buyers supply mercury to the miners. Imagine what will happen if there is, widespread transition to a mercury-free technology. What will happen to those relationships? What will the gold buyers be happy with those kinds of changes? On the contrary, they may in fact try to thwart efforts to go mercury-free because it really eats into their business. So those become very large social barriers. And then also finally, I'll just mention lack of incentives from downstream buyers. There is of course, a movement toward increased purchase of responsible gold. But without the incentives from those buyers for the miners to change their practices, the miners have plenty of other places to sell their gold right now. They have a lot of, whether they're formal or informal buyers. So there really need to be incentives from buyers who care about responsible production in order to incentivize the miners to change their technologies. Otherwise, they can just keep selling to the normal gold markets that they sell to now. So all of those really stand in the way. Lots of different, technical, social, economic barriers to the adoption of these alternatives. But there are plenty of programs around the world from all different kinds of actors trying to improve the situation. One is the Planet Gold program that I'm involved in. Planet Gold is a program funded by the Global Environment Facility. It operates in 8 countries around the world, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And the goal of the program is fundamentally to reduce mercury use in the sector. But to do so, next slide, please, David. To do so, the program really embraces a holistic approach to the reduction of mercury use. So it of course does introduce mercury-free technology, but it also recognizes, as I said, that the root cause of mercury use is the informality of the sector and lack of access to finance. So the program is also engaged in helping the miners to formalize their practices, and also through doing so be recognized and de-risking their operations such that formal finance would be willing to lend or invest in them. And we also work on access to formal markets. As I said, if we can find buyers who are willing to provide, good incentives and want to buy responsible gold, and that provides an advantage to our program participants, that gives them an incentive to move away from mercury technologies into mercury-free technologies. Next slide. So if you want to learn more about the Planet Gold program, you can visit our website, planetgold.org, and you can look across. We have a wide variety of information about the ASM sector generally, about technical solutions that were discussed today, about trade, about all the issues we discussed today and others, formalization, all kinds of information there in our resource and knowledge hub. And then we also have country-specific information about what's going on in our 8 countries that you can follow. So thank you. Over to David.
Perfect, Susan. And thanks everybody presenting that you were so quick, because we have now 12 minutes left to still address a number of questions. If you can see them, maybe you can also look through them, but I already looked at a few of them. There's a couple of questions around mercury trade in Colombia, as well as Bolivia. One question for Colombia, Barbara, was, do you have any data or insight on mercury trade in Colombia? And if not, are there plans on doing that?
Yeah, so like we didn't look into Colombia in specific, but it did come up a few times because we looked into Bolivia, for example, and now also we have one of our partners who also worked on the investigation phase, who's now working on actually creating a documentary about the trade, in which there will also be some more information on Colombia a little bit, but in the report there is unfortunately not much information on Colombia. However, I can say a few words on Bolivia, because I think it came up twice in the questions. For Bolivia, for example, it's one of the countries where I mentioned that a neighboring country is basically having stricter rules, which in this case was Peru in 2015. They made it more complicated to import mercury. And what you could see is that directly, basically, the imports into Bolivia skyrocketed. And now Bolivia is importing a lot more than what they would need for their ASGM sector. Also officially for all kinds of industrial uses. However, most of it ends up in ASGM, and a lot of it actually gets exported into Peru. And what was found is that a lot of the big importers of mercury in Bolivia have ties to Peru. So there's also quite some relationships there. They either own mining companies in Peru, for example, or they are actually of Peruvian origin, now living in Bolivia. So the trade in Bolivia is less informal and more formal, but there are definitely a lot of connections to informal trade that then leaves the country.
Thank you, Barbara. And specifically for Bolivia and any of the other countries you touched on, there are the detailed reports on the IUCN website. So I'd warmly recommend to anybody to go to the website and find those reports, because they're very interesting.
So for Bolivia, it's we're still basically updating the report soon, but for all the other countries, they're already available.
Great.
Sorry.
We've got a question for you, Susan. Looking at the Minamata Convention, are there any case studies of visible improvements in mercury management practices from countries that have ratified the Minamata Convention? In brief, what are the benefits of parties ratifying the convention?
Yeah, well, I hope there will be soon. You know, remember that the convention just went into force in 2017, and so the resources associated with the implementation of the convention are just rolling out. So we're really at the beginning of programs like Planet Gold, which are intended to do exactly that, which is assist parties. The monies coming from the JEF are for parties to the convention specifically. And so the Planet Gold program is an example of where we're in, you know, our program is in the field in 8 countries helping these miners to reduce mercury use and also to help the countries more generally with mercury management. So it's a little bit early days to see the results of such programs, but certainly there's plenty of programs in operation that have that aim. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll be able to show concrete results of how it benefits parties to join the convention and to get access to those kinds of resources.
Perfect. Franco from Peru is commenting to recommend a free technology. Do you do geological tests to find out what type of mineral is in the rock or soil? And I think just commenting on that, and Cyrus, if you have any more thoughts, please add to that. But yeah, geology is incredibly important. Also, the composition of minerals is important. Oftentimes there are trace amounts of other materials. They can be of value, like gold or silver or platinum, but there can also be deleterious elements such as lead that can actually have a significant impact on how you should be processing your gold, because otherwise it might come to reactions between the chemicals that you're using and the trace elements. So it's important to understand geology, but for a lot of artisanal miners, geological data is also out of reach. But Cyrus, do you have anything to add to?
Yeah, so yeah, it also means that nowadays the providers of mining equipment, they most recommend that you send them the samples of your area so that they're able to know exactly how to work out or to customize your area according to the kind of processing that you need. So this is something that also mining companies which are working towards mercury-free processing are geared to, so that they just don't drop any mining equipment in your area without first of all understanding the kind of sample of gold that is there. So this is something that they are really helping in many artisanal miners.
Great. Susan, as in your role with Jeff Gold program, we're getting a question: is there a place where we can find information about mercury-free technologies in more detail, and perhaps how the social process of implementation of such technologies should be conducted? And before you answer, in the slide deck that we are sending out, there's already a number of references, including a few practical guides, but I know that Susan is compiling more information.
Yeah, I'll just add that, yes, please visit our website, planetgold.org, and you can do a search under the resources tab by topic. So you could search for information on mercury-free technologies there. We have a number of different resources. It's interesting that you should mention about, how those are actually rolled out. We're currently working in collaboration with PACT. The organization some of you may be familiar with. They are creating sort of a series of case studies on what has happened in previous programs that have tried to roll out mercury-free technology, and making some observation and recommendations on that topic. So that will be coming soon.
Great. Very briefly, Barbara, and then so that we can still answer other questions. But my question from before, because I do think it's of interest, how did you get information about this very secretive topic of mercury trade?
Yeah, so in each of the countries we worked with local partners on the ground who did basically investigative research, but also research on the policies and the laws in the different countries. But looking into the illegal trade, they did go undercover in parts. They visited mines, but also the hardware shops where mercury gets sold in the cities, and really tried to also go and buy mercury in some cases. And what was found is that in some cases they were really told to go away because people didn't trust them. It got a bit dangerous, especially in Bolivia. And it was definitely a picture that the miners, for example, are really open in how they get the mercury. They did tell basically the researchers a lot of information, and the higher you got in the supply chain, the more difficult it was, because people did get more wary of the questions that were asked.
Great. There's one question directed at us that the Impact Facility has provided a gold catcher ourselves through the equipment lease scheme that we are doing in Uganda, and for the last year it hasn't been used much. And the question is, why is that, and what are we doing to change that? I think any of the reasons for cultural barriers to change would apply here. There was little trust in the technology to begin with, and we really put a lot of effort into showcasing that the recovery is higher. We mentioned previously that the technologies that Cyrus now showcased in this presentation have recovery of 90% or higher. If we compare the two traditional sluice mets, and that hasn't been said yet, we're looking at 40 to 60% recovery rates on average using mercury and just normal sluice mets. So there is a significant improvement, and there's also a blog article on our website that details a test that we've done. But yeah, there's a lot of factors and a lot of difficulty in convincing people, and so we are committed to keep engaging and try to showcase how that works. But one of the main concerns of miners, especially in that region of Uganda, for most of the time is actual production. There was another factor playing in that a lot of the technologies only work at a bigger scale. And if you are hardly producing anything because you can't cope with the rains, then it's difficult to justify investment into technology that might replace mercury. So we are working with miners throughout East Africa to see how we can address production short bottlenecks so that they can fully utilize the mercury processing equipment that we've installed in Tanzania as well as in Uganda. I think we have time for one more question, and maybe Susan, Cyrus, and Barbara, you can look through which one you'd like to pick. If there's a burning question that hasn't been answered today, please feel free to email me at david@impactfacility.com. And I hope to welcome a few of you back next time on June 24th when we look at gender and ASM, and then if in case you missed that one, at least tune back in after the summer. when we look more at the supply chain and trade and yeah, global gold trade and the role of ASM here. But is there any last question that either of you wants to answer?
Hi, if it's okay, I guess I would just like to amplify what you've said, David, about and what a lot of the themes of these questions. You know, this isn't just a matter of swapping out technology. You know, what this really is very deep systems change that requires a deep understanding of the local socioeconomic environment, customs, power dynamic, you know, all kinds of things. This isn't, you know, of course the technology is important, the geology is important, all of those things are, you know, the financial aspects, but at the end of the day, it's really about people and how they organize their business and their economy, who's in charge and who has power and who doesn't. So really the very first starting place of Mercury transformation has to begin with a really deep understanding of the ASGM communities and, you know, what their objectives are, what their incentives are, and really speaking to those local conditions. That's why there's no one silver bullet solution to this issue. It's really a very bespoke process that requires a lot of on-the-ground field work and understanding. So it'll be slow going. We shouldn't expect transformation overnight, but hopefully enough of us around the world are working together that we can make real progress.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you everybody for joining. We're just a minute over the time that we aimed for. If you haven't yet been to either Solidaridad's website or ours, I encourage you to do so. Equally, check out the IUCN report and the work of Jeff Gold. All the links are in the presentation. At the Impact Facility specifically, we try to put the technologies into the hands of miners and do so through various impact investing schemes. So please have a look. And if you're a company and you're looking to support an organization, please also feel free to get in touch. And thanks a lot to all of the speakers and all the hard work that went into preparing these wonderful slides.